Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the EU Taxonomy of Sustainable Activities. We're really glad to have you all here today. We are being hosted by the International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA. My name is Bridget John, and I'm being joined today by my colleague from IAIA, Laura Lee Fortuny. If you hear or see anything that you would like to share out on social media, you see our Twitter handle is listed there, as well as the IAIA webinar hashtag. So feel free to share it. For any of you who are new to IAIA, or as a refresher for those of you who've been long-term members, just an invitation for you to visit our website and check out all of the things that are available free to everybody. In fact, we have a large library of webinars on demand from recordings of past webinars. We've got ESG, COVID impacts on impact assessment work, and a large variety of other topics from biodiversity to health to resettlement to social. Air quality, so many. We also do have a webinar upcoming next week on emerging technologies for biodiversity impact assessment. That's organized by our Washington area branch, so we hope that you will sign up for that as well. We are very, very excited to be having our first in-person annual conference since 2019. We'll be gathering in Vancouver in May, and if there's still time for you to register through April 13th, you can register, and you're not going to want to miss that conference. In terms of training, we offer a variety of things. In terms of our annual conference, there are in-person training courses offered in conjunction with that in-person in Vancouver this year. But we also new this month have launched online training courses. We took our in-person training courses and tweaked them to make them fit a virtual context. And so we had one of them is wrapping up, another one is starting, and we have another one in June and more to come. So check out our site for that. And we also offer training through a Foundations and Impact Assessment course, which is part of our professional development program. And that is a self-paced online course that the unique part is that you're paired up with a mentor. And we've gotten great feedback from that. The registration for our next course opens April 6th, and it runs from June to August. And finally, we have a wealth of free publications available on our website, whether that ranges from kind of quick information like our fast tips, which is 2 pages of 5 important things to know and 5 important things to do about a particular topic, or more in-depth documents like our best practice principles series. We have guidance and handbooks, so just a wealth, plus translations being added all the time. So please visit iai.org. On that resources tab, you are going to find links to all of this information for webinars and publications and training. Before we get started into the meat of why we are all here today, just a few pieces of housekeeping for you. At the top of your GoToWebinar control panel, you're going to see a white arrow, and it's in an orange or a red box. If you think that your control panel is in your way from the slides or the speaker's faces, feel free to click that and it will minimize your control panel. You can always click that button again to pop it back out if you need to. We are indeed recording this webinar, and in a day or two, you will receive a link to that recording. The panel will be fielding questions towards the end of our session today, but don't feel like you have to wait until the end. In the gray bars on your control panel for GoToWebinar, you should see a questions or a chat bar. Feel free to type in your questions at any time throughout the webinar, and we will be moderating those on the back end and make sure the panel gets to those questions at the end. Because it's a panel discussion mostly today, there aren't too many slides available. However, the ones that we do, we will make available to you, and you'll get that in the link to the recording that you receive in a day or two. Well, with that, we are into the heart of our webinar, and We are very excited to have you here to talk about the EU taxonomies of sustainable investment and activities. And so I'm going to turn it over now to our moderator, Alan Bond. He is an associate professor at the School of Environmental Science at the University of East Anglia in the UK. And he's also co-chair of IAIA's Emerging Technologies section. So Alan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Bridget. It's really good to see so many attendees today. I've been told, whilst the numbers of attendees are climbing, we've had 455 people register representing 89 different countries. So that's absolutely fantastic. And thank you all for your engagement with the topic. So the webinar will be structured as follows. Next, Jiří, Dusík and myself will introduce the EU taxonomy and provide some initial thoughts on the implications of the taxonomy for impact assessment. It will end with an introduction to the panel members. Now, the presentation covers much of a journal paper submitted to the IAIA's journal Impact Assessment and Project Appraisal, or IAPA, and that was the basis for a roundtable discussion that will be introduced and explained by Thomas Fischer after the presentation has finished. Thomas will also summarize some of the responses that were made in IAPA to that paper, and we'll run a very short poll to get initial views from attendees on questions related to the presentation. After that, I'll open up the panel for debate, and my role at that point will be purely to act as a discussion moderator. I'll first seek the panelists' responses to the question raised by the presentation before opening up the debate to questions asked by the audience. To make sure there's a seamless transition, and Bridget's already invited you, please feel free to start asking questions now using the question part of GoToWebinar, and feel free to ask any new questions as we progress through the webinar. Thomas will be picking out questions for the panel. I should finish by saying we will finish on time. The last thing that will happen is that Jiří will close, setting out some next steps before that final close. Okay, so at that point, I think it's time for me to hand over to Jiří for the presentation.
Okay, good. Thank you very much, Alan, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar. It's actually quite interesting how much interest there is in the taxonomies of sustainable investment or sustainable economic activities, and how they actually link with our core job as the impact assessment community globally that associates within the framework of the IAIA. So I'm very happy to give this presentation also on behalf of Alan, since we started looking at it actually 6 months ago when the taxonomy regulation in the EU came out, and started wondering what may change in our profession as a result of it, and how we as a professional community could support some of the aspirations that are behind the sustainable finance taxonomies. With that, I would like to quickly start, perhaps. Yeah, thank you. So, as you surely know, the Glasgow Climate Summit has been a rather successful event in raising the interest of the corporate sector and the financial world in the not only in the climate change agenda, but also in the general issue of sustainability. And there are these very impressive commitments to mobilize over 130 trillion US dollars in assets, which is over 40% of the global financial assets, towards the transition to carbon neutrality, and also to transparent reporting and accounting of the progress which is achieved by the various entities that have committed themselves to achieving those targets. And I think that this is obviously a major tipping point in the investment world, and it starts raising a rather fundamental question. How do we actually ensure that that really these commitments are made? How do we measure them? How do we compare them and see what needs to be done in order to put them to actually support the transition to net zero? The next slide. Those of you who are dealing with the environmental, social, and governance ratings are familiar that there is a plethora of approaches that are being used by different service providers, and actually choice of a service provider may actually lead to very different rating results, because they use a different lens, different focus, different metrics. And this actually, the next slide, started raising attention of those interested in prudent banking practices, and that are warning of the need to actually put in place a proper regulatory oversight and verification mechanisms of any pledge towards environmental sustainability, climate neutrality, and so on. And also to make sure that actually it's not just the self-reporting, but it's actually subject to some sort of control, because otherwise it may this type of reporting, if not done well, may mislead the otherwise well-intentioned investors. Sorry, can you go one slide before that? Yeah, up. Okay, one slide up. Okay. Actually, yes, yes, G20. Okay. Actually, on the global level, there is a lot of coordination on international alignment and coordination on sustainable finance. And in October, a G20 sustainable finance roadmap has been published. It includes a lot of interesting things related to this workshop. These high-level principles for alignment and coordination, which basically the top two ones require anyone who actually commits to climate neutrality and sustainability to ensure that there is really material positive contributions to these outcomes, and also at the same time avoid negative contribution to some of the other sustainability goals. We know this very well from our work when, for example, climate change adaptation strategies may have potentially significant adverse impacts on the environment and so on, or indeed the whole question about the biofuels, etc., and their impacts on the ecosystems just shows the importance of having these dual requirements of substantive contribution, significant substantive contribution, and at the same time, no significant harm to the other sustainability goals and objectives. The next slide. Thank you. Within this context, it's actually quite interesting to see the emergence of the sustainable finance taxonomies, which really started a decade ago with an internal checklist by the Climate Bonds Initiative that has actually been later elaborated into more sophisticated catalog, and has inspired similar types of developments in other jurisdictions, namely in China. But there are other countries. I myself have seen one in Vietnam when I worked there, and other countries have them. The major moment in their evolution came with the adoption of the EU Taxonomy for Sustainable Activities, which is actually the most sophisticated mechanisms, at least to our knowledge or to our reading, which is available globally. And that mechanism may inspire actually other jurisdictions to adopt similar taxonomies. The next slide, please. As this map shows to you, that there is over 30 jurisdictions that are currently that have either developed or are developing various taxonomies of green or sustainable investments. So actually there is quite a bit of momentum, because if you look at this map, it covers pretty much most of the industrialized countries. For us, the next slide. For next one, for us, the key topic of this seminar, as I've mentioned, is the EU taxonomy of sustainable activities, which actually stipulates these core principles of what the sustainable finance should do, what it should not do, and also starts looking into to social safeguards. The next slide. Basically, the taxonomy is centered, except of reporting mechanisms and so on. It is a voluntary tool or tool which actually should be used for self-reporting. It's not a prescriptive economic framework that needs to be followed by every industrial enterprise. It applies to the participants in the EU financial markets, to major listed companies that have to report on their as part of the non-financial disclosure on their environmental footprint. So this actually systematizes, the EU taxonomy systematizes what they should be reporting. Actually, the objectives are fairly strategic, but address most of the environmental issues that we normally deal in our practice. They deal with the climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, sustainable use and protection of water and marine resources, transition to circular economy, pollution prevention and control, and protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. The next one. Having this backbone of 6 high-level objectives, the EU taxonomy declares that the activity which is sustainable and can be reported by these reporting entities has to make a substantial contribution to at least one of those environmental objectives, without at the same time not harming significantly any other environmental objective. And this is an interesting point for us as impact assessment community, because you know that we tend used to focus primarily on adverse impacts and their management and mitigation, and had the difficulties in coping with the cumulative and synergistic impacts of multiple activities in the territory, which actually have led to these rather worrying environmental trends, and they have led to significant, sometimes, deterioration in ecosystem functions and services on which we depend. So the taxonomy, in a way, changes it, because it requires the activities not just to avoid significant impact on any of these headline objectives, but also to make a substantial contribution to at least one of them. The taxonomy at the same time defines some minimal social safeguards that we will not address as part of this webinar. They may be addressed later. But what is interesting is that it's the regulation that has set it up mandates the European Commission to create so-called delegated act or delegated regulations to define specific technical screening criteria for that would make it easier for various parties, sometimes the bankers or corporate managers or people in the corporate world may not know exactly what may be behind these objectives. So, so the technical screening criteria should define it in a very clear terms what the sustainability means in a specific specific context, being, for example, cement production or or transport systems or renewable energy systems. And these technical criteria are meant as an evolving tool, and they are going to actually, I think, inspire, I suspect, inspire a lot of the impact assessment practices in the future, because they are fairly well developed, because the authors of this of the technical screening criteria have considered the direct, indirect, cumulative impacts, but they have also considered, let's say, not only the in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation, the scope 1 and 2 emissions of the greenhouse gases, but also the scope 3 emissions, which are notoriously difficult to manage when you look at one specific project and you don't have enough time to set well the boundaries of your assessment. I will give you an example of the climate change mitigation objective and the requirements of the taxonomy and the technical screening criteria now. The next slide. Okay, the Article 10 of the this framework taxonomy regulation 2020 852 actually, which deals with the climate change mitigation objectives, says that an economic activity shall qualify as contributing substantially to climate change mitigation, where it contributes substantially to the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at the levels which basically prevent the meltdown of the Earth climate system and actually support the achievement of the Paris Agreement. And then it lists the broad categories of the interventions that can be actually implemented to achieve that objective. They would include generation, transmission, storage, and distribution of renewable energy, energy efficiency measures, and so on. They would also promote the use of carbon capture, utilization and storage, etc. So the list is quite actually inspirational for those of you who are often thinking about the mitigation hierarchy or the opportunities for enhancement measures within the EIA or SEA systems. These actually, the regulation itself provides a very good list of initial suggestions on what can be discussed with the planners or your clients if they wish to make a substantive contribution to, let's say, climate change mitigation. The next slide. Well, then last summer, since last summer, we have seen various versions of the technical screening criteria, which have been actually finalized at the end of the year and have been issued. There have been a lot of controversies around them, whether to include nuclear power or gas distribution and utilization. Well, eventually these interventions got there under the transitional arrangements, but I think without these, putting these two sets of interventions aside, I think the technical screening criteria in the delegated regulation are extremely useful because they list the activities which may contribute substantially to either climate change mitigation objective or climate change adaptation objective. Currently, the list covers only the first two objectives. There are the other activities that would contribute to the other four activities. The two objectives are being currently elaborated, they are being discussed, and the technical screening criteria are being defined for them. But currently we have only the technical screening criteria for these two objectives, but they are still fairly inspirational in many ways, and often they simplify the assessments of those interventions. This is just an example of one activity. The activities that are coded and which actually says that one of the eligible activities would be transmission and distribution networks for renewable and low carbon gases, and then it defines what this activity needs to do in order to quantify as substantially contributing to climate change mitigation, and what it should not do, not to significantly harm other environmental objectives. And actually, the do no significant harm obligations are in many ways fairly similar to what we do under the EIA systems, but they are slightly different. There are usually no screenings. Some of them relate to EIA processes, some of them relate to biodiversity assessments and so on. So they are similar but different in scope and slightly different in their ambition. And actually that raises a very interesting set of questions. The next slide. Yes, obviously the question is, these taxonomies are going to regulate the decision-making of major corporate players. So what are their implications for our future work? Next slide. We have actually, I come from a consulting company, and already since last summer, we have started seeing actually early requests of how we would assess the do no significant harm principle when it comes to various interventions, either implemented by the EU program management authorities. We had a discussion with one major global infrastructure developer and operator that wants to be 100% taxonomy compliant by the 2030. We had discussions with the business consulting company, one of the major consulting and accounting companies globally that are suddenly very interested in these services that they will be providing. And also we had serious discussions with the banking sector, and we had one discussion with a bank and guarantee provider because they have so far used slightly different systems of safeguards. So the question was for them: so how will the taxonomy apply to us, and what do we do if we operate in different territories, etc. The next slide. I would actually define from the types of questions we've heard. I would define the questions on three levels: the micro level, meta level, and macro level. And I will deal with the first two sets of questions that we, as consultants, deal with. The first set of questions relates to input data. Basically, the taxonomy requires something similar to what EIA does, but sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less, or different. So where the taxonomy, those entities that wish to comply with the taxonomy get their input data, how they can get them in different formats and so on. We hear various theories that there may be these data mining companies and they will process it, or that there will be these knowledge systems in the future that will actually sort it out. Sometimes some of it can be helped with the expert systems or knowledge systems that computer-aided questions and so on, but a lot of it will actually require rigorous assessments which comply with the principles of good impact assessment practice. And if you see those types of questions, I think from what I've read about the beginning of the EIA system development in the US in the 70s, I think the types of questions that our colleagues dealing with the taxonomy are similar to those that the impact assessment community has been dealing with in the 70s. Well, the second one, more interesting questions even, is what do we do if our projects have to meet different obligations? For example, if we have to do want to report under taxonomy, but we have to do still EIA, it does something a little bit different. And actually, EU has a whole set of requirements related to do no significant harm principle for its funding operations under the Resilience and Recovery Facility and the EU cohesion policy programs and just transition mechanism and so on. And because they evolved in different points in time, they are similar but slightly different. So currently, you may have a different actually set of obligations which are broadly similar but different, and it would be actually useful for many operators to know exactly what they have to do in order to get on with the analysis. The third, a longer-term question is that there will obviously be needs for some sort of verification, because currently some providers we are doing, for example, one project for a private developer that will submit his taxonomy compliance kind of document, and that will not be verified. But I think over time, we can see the need for some sort of verification of these of the data, at least those data that is being submitted to the taxonomy-related reporting. And the question is how to avoid the duplications and streamline the processes. So perhaps the question is, can EIA and SEA systems in the future seemingly generate very easily the data that could be directly applicable, or even could provide even directly applicable information for the taxonomy-related disclosure. At the meso level question, in terms of the EIA systems design, is the whole questions of how can we as an impact assessment community use the taxonomy. When Alan and I were writing the paper, we thought of obvious opportunities, such as look at the taxonomy requirements and technical screening criteria when you do your scoping process. They can be very helpful, I believe, for the consideration of alternatives and mitigation and enhancement measures. Well, there can be in the future requirements that actually there can be an optional assessment of the taxonomy alignment of the activity as part of EIA. I can perhaps, well, as a practitioner who is not managing any system or regulating the system, I can foresee such an opportunity in years to come. And the question is whether the EIA review and issuance, those who issue EIA system statements would be in the future referring to some of these technical screening criteria for the taxonomy. So these are the questions that we come across as the EIA practitioners. We have put some of them in our papers with Alan, and I think that started very interesting discussion, which I'm looking forward to follow for the rest of the webinar. And I would like to hand over the floor to Alan and to introduce the biggest question, perhaps, of all that we will be addressing here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jiří. So next slide. Yeah, so Jiří's there been talking about implementation issues, but the big question that we were asking in our paper was whether there be a mindset change, and part and parcel of that is what the taxonomy means for our understanding of sustainability. So next slide, please, Bridget. And this is kind of how we see it. So sustainable development is subject to lots of different viewpoints and understandings. And in this slide, basically, I've just presented a couple of them. There's an economic framing of sustainable development, which is the bit in red at the top. And then there's an ecological framing of sustainable development, which is the green at the bottom. And if I look at the green to begin with, there's a spectrum all the way from shallow ecology. And for shallow ecology, it basically means that you appreciate that ecological resources have value for human beings and can be used in order to deliver economic gain, socioeconomic gain. A deep ecology framing says that all species have rights, and because of those rights, we can't impact at all on any ecological resource. Now, if we translate that to an economic framing, and an economic framing is considered to be what prevails in a neoliberal world and decision-making as we understand it, it's kind of commonly understood as three pillars of sustainability: social, economic, and environmental. And a weak sustainability framing says that as long as you pass on to future generations an equivalent total amount of capital, that's fine. so you can replace environmental capital with socio-economic capital. Strong sustainability is supposed to be based on the premise that you pass on at least as much environmental capital to future generations. And it's called strong because inherent in that is some expected protection of the environment. But there's a distinction made in the literature about absurdly strong sustainability, where there is complete protection of all environmental resources, and strong sustainability as it's practiced in decision making still allows some kind of trade-off between different environmental capitals. Notwithstanding that, prevailing decision making is really based on weak sustainability, recognizing there are socio-economic benefits, therefore we can accept environmental losses. And the bit in the middle there about biodiversity, climate and water, because they're all indicated in the EU taxonomy, basically they can all be traded in weak sustainability or shallow ecology framing. But if we move towards deep ecology framing, they can't be traded at all with each other or with any other component. Next slide, please, Bridget. So very quickly, it struck us that the EU taxonomy, given the do no significant harm safeguards approach and also positive expectations or positive sustainability commitments, is really heading towards the right-hand side of this diagram. It's much more able to protect these ecological, climate and water components than is standard economic framing used within decision making. And this was the basis for the paper that we wrote, making this argument that it's a change in mindset. If we're going to start to think that you have to provide positive gains in one of the 6 components listed in the taxonomy and not impact negatively on any of the other 5, then that's a mindset change. And that leads, I think, through to the last slide here. There are some question marks obviously associated with whether we can get a mindset change. The first of these relates to the politics of decision making. So implementation depends on political and societal mindsets. And we know battles are already being fought. For example, over the inclusion of nuclear and gas as sustainable forms of energy supply as part of the transition being acceptable within the taxonomy. The prevailing argument has to shift towards do no significant harm, these minimum social safeguards and substantial contributions. But when there's an economic imperative, it's really quite hard to see that happening. And today in the UK, we've seen in the budget, we've had a 5% reduction in fuel duty per litre because of the ballooning costs of fuels for vehicles. For historical precedents, we've had kind of 5 decades of attempts to improve impact assessment instruments. And I think most people would argue that there have been incremental improvements, incremental changes, but we really need something radical to shift us away from this kind of weak sustainability mindset. And it means not following these past precedents that we've seen in the past. Otherwise, incremental erosion of environmental services will continue into the future. And Jiří mentioned looming emergencies, the environmental tipping points that are being reached. So again, we kind of feel like do no significant harm is likely to have a positive implication for helping to avert these looming emergencies if the mindset happens. But go back to the politics of decision making. It's not a simple change to make, but it's the beginning. It's the beginning if the finance industry starts to move in this direction. And the final one there on transitions, none of this can happen overnight. So there needs to be a transition period in order to implement a mindset change. We're seeing arguments already that Germany can't cut gas from Russia, for example. So it tends to take years in order to make the kind of changes that we would expect to see demanded if the mindset change is implemented and we really try and deliver do no significant harm. Next slide, please, Bridget. So that takes us to introducing the panel. Before I introduce Thomas, before we actually get to the panel discussion. So I'm very grateful to have today the people listed. Actually, I won't spend time reading out their names, and we won't eat into the panel discussion time we've got later by asking people to introduce themselves individually. The first three people listed are all people who responded to the paper myself and Jiří wrote. And then we're very grateful to have Angela, who's representing the European Investment Bank. So we're grateful to have some people representing the finance industry, and also Wes Fischer, who's the co-chair of the IAIA's Climate Change and Impact Assessment Action Plan. So the group that's really trying to drive forward positive changes that will help to deal with the climate emergency that we're all experiencing. Okay, so that kind of concludes the presentation of the taxonomy, an explanation of the taxonomy, a little bit of evidence for why we think it's leading to a mindset change and what kind of issues are raised by implementing the taxonomy and where they start to interface with impact assessment. What I want to do now is hand over to Professor Thomas Fischer. Thomas is from the University of Liverpool and also Northwest University in South Africa. He's the editor of the journal Impact Assessment and Project Appraisal, which is the journal of IAIA. And what Thomas is going to do is introduce the IAPA roundtable paper, the concept of the roundtable, and give some early conclusions before we head over to the panel to give their views. So over to you, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Alan. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. And thank you for the introductory notes and the initial presentation. We already have questions coming in. Can I just ask those who formulate questions to please explain abbreviations? So questions are coming in from different world regions, and it will be difficult with abbreviations that actually mean or may mean something different in different countries. Right. So as Alan said, and Jiří as well, today's webinar follows on from a discussion forum called Roundtable that we have had in Impact Assessment and Project Appraisal, the journal of the International Association for Impact Assessment, on taxonomies of sustainable finance. You find that roundtable in the latest issue of the journal, so that's 2022. It consists of 9 papers, a paper triggering the discussion by Jiří, Dusík and Alan Bond, and then 7 responses, and also a repost by Jiří and Alan. Very briefly, in terms of what the roundtable approach in the journal Impact Assessment and Project Appraisal is, it has previously also been employed on 3 occasions already. 2003, where the question was asked about the ability of impact assessment to deliver sustainability. Then in 2006, where the focus was on how to improve impact assessment quality. And in 2014, where we looked at how to strengthen impact assessment through integration. All issues well worth reading. At this point, Bridget, can I ask you to open the poll? We have, yeah, well, there we go. So we have a poll here, and whilst I speak, I'm asking participants to please take part in the poll. So we have a couple of questions, and already there are actually the responses coming in. So it's about, do you think that taxonomy-related assessments should be integrated within the IAIA process? And then there is a second question, which will come up in a minute. I'm just going to continue now. So I'm going to very briefly summarize 4 responses of people who can't be here today, and there's a common theme running through these. Those that are here today and who contributed to the special issue and who gave responses to Alan and Jiří. They are going to present their responses, a summary of their responses themselves. So we had one response from Roel Slotweg from the Netherlands, who suggested that current weaknesses of environmental impact assessment are based on processes in society and not so much to the instrument itself. And he warns that these are weaknesses that may actually hinder the implementation of the EU taxonomy as well. However, he does see a window of opportunity in society to move from the limited and what he calls the flawed do no harm approach to a transition-focused do good approach. We then had a response by Kong Vu from Vietnam. He agreed with Jiří and Alan in that the taxonomy for sustainable finance will establish an umbrella to consolidate various impact assessment tools into one consolidated system and harmonize the associated benefits. He underlines the important change in focus on positive outcomes and transparency. So again, that aspect of positive outcomes is at the heart of his response. A third response by Rufus Howard from the UK, who sees a continuing strong role of environmental impact assessment, even if we work with taxonomy. He suggests, however, that EIA itself is handicapped by its position as a subsidiary decision support tool. He argues that taxonomy of sustainable finance values need to be integrated not into EIA, but rather into the wider cross-departmental government operating policy and procedures. He does go on to criticize that our current approach towards EIA, in particular in the UK in this case, is too much focused on reducing negative impacts only. And then there is one more response by Juan Palerm, who's based in Spain, who suggests that sustainable finance strategies are raising the sustainability bar and that impact assessment needs to evolve to create a fruitful symbiosis. He underlines the positive agenda approach, again, positive agenda approach to sustainability. And in this context, he says that minimizing impacts becomes the bare minimum, where positive contributions to transformative change towards environmental sustainability, low carbon and climate resilient development come to the forefront of what we mean by sustainable. Right, and that was the short summary I wanted to give. And without further ado, I think I'm going at this stage to hand over to Ellen again. Right, we have the poll.
Well, we have a second poll, don't we? Can we just run the second poll? Yeah, here we go, because I'm really interested in the answer to this one as well before we get to the panel. So if people could quickly do this. It's really interesting to see the result from the first poll. I have to say that the majority of people, maybe it's a biased audience, of course, that do think that the taxonomy and impact assessment should be integrated. And here I can see the results as they're coming in. So that's now closed. So will it lead to a mindset change? So 2/3 of people, that's 50% of people voting. So about 100 people, of 100 people who voted, 66% think that there will be a mindset change. So I think that's quite interesting, and 7% say no. And this is really a good launch point now for us going to the panel, I think. So if you could facilitate, what I'd like to do now is ask the panelists to all turn their cameras and their microphones on. I see we've got loads of good questions coming in, so I sympathize with Thomas having to choose between them. But before we get to the audience questions, what I'd like to do is ask the panelists for their responses in the same way that Thomas gave a very brief response for the roundtable members who aren't here. We have Thomas and we have Bryan, and we should have Maria. She comes back on. So Thomas, what was your response?
All right, am I unmuted? I think I am. I was positive about it, but also had some doubts. I was reflecting not just sort of on what this may mean for SEA and EIA, but also I was looking at the role currently played by cost-benefit analysis. I concluded, in a nutshell, that if the use of taxonomies lead to cost-benefit analysis, which is not corrupted by powerful interests, which I think is happening quite a bit, and which can result in realistic estimations of costs and benefits, as well as to SEA and EIA applications whose results are not traded off with alleged economic advantages, that would indeed be highly beneficial. Can I just add that there's two things. One, I think there is a number of EU initiatives where the taxonomy should become active. For example, the trans-European transport networks. And I believe at the moment, for example, there's no IA, no impact assessment being done for that. And that should certainly happen. What gives me a bit of a headache, really, is that the taxonomy seems to be working on the basis this is a sustainable and that is a non-sustainable activity. I really believe what a taxonomy should be doing is formulating conditions for when a particular activity may be sustainable. So it's not sort of straightforward, a one-way road here. And I think impact assessment can certainly help. And I was wondering why impact assessment wasn't used when, well, devising the taxonomy itself, helping to identify those activities that are sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you. Maria?
Thank you, Alan. Well, I will summarize what I actually have written on that response. And I didn't actually question or analyze the taxonomy per se. I simply addressed the big question that you were raising, which I, as you know, found absolutely fantastic. And even I called it, okay, there's new hope again. And let's hope that this time it's going to work. So that was my main feeling. But then maybe because of, you know, as time goes by, we got a bit more experience and we got used to see past experiences failing or not delivering to the expectations that they've raised in the beginning. I looked at it again at your arguments. So I was not looking like Thomas just did in terms of the taxonomy per se, but I looked at your arguments and I thought, well, do we have, you know, the right soil to put the seed on? Do we have the right conditions to actually have a response from the impact assessment professionals and not only the IAIA community to be able to have a successful outcome in terms of the relationship between various tools of impact assessment and the taxonomy. And I, you know, that's when I started getting worried because, well, because one of the issues I picked up was the meaning of do no significant harm. What does that mean? You know, significance is a concept within impact assessment that we have not yet completely resolved. I mean, I think it's much better now, particularly as, you know, those incremental advances that we have been able to do, namely because of public engagement. So that becomes, and being more transparent and all that, but it's still not completely, and it will never be, I would say, from my mind, written in stone exactly what significant is. So what does it mean exactly, do no significant harm, and how much will that be for certain organizations, for certain financial institutions, for certain environmental authorities, for certain countries, whether in more developing or developed countries. Then the other issue, which is really the issue of the mindset, is how much are we going to be able to change this mindset? And I don't want to think, and I completely agree with you, that we have to start somewhere, we have to push for it. But I cannot ignore the results of our last conference in presence in Brisbane, and the discussion between being evolutionary or revolutionary. And nobody, or the majority, did not want to go through the revolutionary route. And in order to be able for environmental impact assessment and SEA and health impact assessment and all those instruments to be able to provide a response and be up to the challenge that the taxonomy is raising now, because it's raising the bar, as you very well say, I'm not sure that the whole multitude of actors that we have within impact assessment are prepared or able to improve and change their mindset in order to, for example, start thinking about positive impacts rather than negative. To my own experience, and I try to be very positive in my experience, that's not what they want to read. Normally, whether it is the authorities or even sometimes other groups within the public and stakeholders, what they really want to see is the negative impact. And that is as we speak. So that was in a nutshell the main message that I left in my response. Again, I'm not commenting on the taxonomy per se. I leave it for a later occasion if that comes up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Bryan.
Thanks, Ellen. I certainly think the concept has the potential for a mindset change in the narrative. And it comes from the key point that Thomas made of looking at positive contributions to specific environmental policy objectives. The continuation of the do no significant harm is similar to EIA, although it's on a broader canvas because it's sustainable objectives, not just environmental objectives. It is an opportunity to radically improve environmental outcomes and avoid the trade-offs as you've indicated. There are limitations though with environmental impact assessment when sustainability limits are exceeded. Environmental impact assessment allows adverse effects. So if you have exceeded sustainability limits, then there is no capacity for further development unless proactive interventions are undertaken for environmental improvement. And if you look at the types of assessment that are now being considered for sustainability, it still includes the concept of impact assessment for projects relating to resource use and environmental discharges. We'll probably see a need for a greater emphasis in cumulative impact assessment when we're looking at the incremental contribution that's being made by projects to what's gone on in the past, that project, and also what's contemplated in the future. Cumulative impact assessment at least acknowledges the concept of carrying capacity and sustainability limits, but it doesn't address what happens when limits are exceeded. And we need to be looking at some of the new methodologies which go beyond environmental impact assessment, such as resilience assessment, which looks at changes and disturbances that can lead to system failure. And we're having to deal with a lot of those issues internationally at the moment. And also recovery assessment, where we're trying to maintain system sustainability. And these are quite different from impact assessment. Sustainable development does need positive contributions. And there are probably 4 generic types that I think we should be looking at. Firstly, reducing pressure on resource use. Climate change example is the use of carbon neutral technologies for energy production to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, to address legacy issues of accumulated changes in the past, such as the closure of coal-fired power plants as an example in dealing with some of the climate change. Thirdly, we need to be looking at increasing resilience to accommodate change. And a lot of the work that's going on adapting infrastructure for increasing climate extremes is a climate change example. And finally, and fourthly, looking at the rehabilitation of restoring where there have been adverse effects, such as restoring soil carbon through improved agricultural practices as a climate example. if you look at evaluating the effects on other sustainability goals, there is no doubt the impact assessment methodology that we have is a valid approach. And I think this is where it can make a significant contribution. And by the impact assessment methodology, I mean the process of screening for effects on other sustainable development goals, the description of the proposal elements that affect sustainable development goals, our typical project description, the existing environment, which is the baseline consideration of other sustainable goals, the impact prediction, which is evaluating effects on the other sustainable development goals, impact mitigation, which is avoiding the remedying or mitigating adverse effects on those other goals, and also the concept of approval conditions, where there are actions required to actually address these adverse effects. I think impact assessment methodology is expanding into a lot of the areas that are now much broader with sustainable development goals. We saw some interesting contributions in IAIA in Brisbane on matters like gender equity and corruption risk, not the traditional things that are covered in environmental impact assessment. I think this means that there is a complementary role for impact assessment in the EU taxonomy. For proactive contributions to sustainable development, it requires an outcome-based management, whereas impact assessment is an effects-based management approach. Certainly, I see that assessing the effects on other sustainable development goals requires effects-based management consistent with the impact assessment methodology. In sustainability assessment, there is still a role for impact assessment of development, as long as the limits of sustainability have not been exceeded. But I think there are also going to be assessment methodologies that are needed, such as cumulative impact assessment, resilience assessment, and recovery assessment. Thanks, Alan.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Brian, and thanks for staying up so late. Angela, put you on the spot. I think the part of the issue that we have at the moment is that I really want to get to some audience questions. So if I can ask you and Wes to try and be brief, but you haven't had an opportunity at all actually to respond. So what's your view, having heard the presentation?
Thank you very much, Alan. I will be very brief because I actually agree with all the things that was already mentioned here. From my side, I just want to share with you the fact that in the last period, I made an analysis of the non-climate do no significant harm and how this should be applied to financial products, because I'm coming from a financial institution. The idea of the taxonomy is, of course, a very good one, trying to introduce uniform approach when you define a sustainability investment. This is the positive part, but in the meantime, this comes with a lot of challenges. If we are looking to the delegated act and the list of the criteria that are mentioned there, it's clear that environmental impact assessment plays a key role, and environmental impact assessment is one of the process-based criteria. It's a generic criteria which is mentioned in one of the annex of the delegated act, and it's actually in some cases probably will need to be more detailed, because the taxonomy regulation doesn't refer only to the mitigation and compensation measures, refers also to other types of assessment that was already mentioned, speaking about the appropriate assessment, speaking about the impact on water. We are talking about an assessment of the pressure of a water body. So there are very detailed assessment that plays a key role when defining the alignment with the do no significant harm, being one of the pillars when we are talking about the taxonomy alignment. It's challenging. We are looking to all those criteria. it will be a change, probably not only in terms of how to approach an environmental impact assessment, but how to think about the future activities, about how to design the future activities, how the alternatives should be looking for, being as a key element in defining, as I said, the alignment with the taxonomy. Not in the last mentioning is the fact that in some cases the market probably is not ready to implement those measures. The level of the details that are required by the delegated act are really the one that needs probably further analysis and further details. But all the starts are difficult, all the changes are from the beginning difficult, but I'm very confident that in few years we will discuss about the good practices in terms of taxonomy.
Brilliant, that's very encouraging, thank you. Wes.
Thanks, Alan. Actually, I'm very excited to have seen your and Jiří's paper come out, and to read the responses, and then your summation on the value of financial taxonomies using the EU taxonomy as a model. You know, I came out of, I was a youth involved in the push for the formation of EPA and the National Environmental Policy Act in the US, and the creation of the Council on Environmental Quality, and the creation of environmental impact assessment. I thought that was a very important moment, you know, from the point of view of Darwinian kind of a leap. And I think what you are looking at, this mindset change, is potentially similar in impact. This in fact could be very important. I do see greenwashing and powerful lobbying as a component of this that will diminish our ambition a bit. But I think there's a new generation of practitioners and an audience. If you look within the corporate world itself, we're all becoming aware of these carrying capacity issues that are the carrying capacity issues go far beyond climate change. So I had the climate change section, but the kind of thing that's come out of the Stockholm Resilience Center on all of these different carrying capacity issues that are extremely serious, that we're going to find that the awareness of that is really reaching very far, and even the entities that would normally be looking at the economic bottom line rather than the ecological bottom line, they are sensitized, and I think there's a big mindset change about to happen, and that this helps lead it. There are other components, but this helps lead it. And looking at the climate change section, we have an action plan given to us by the IAIA board. It's primarily designed to reach out beyond ourselves so that we do less talking to ourselves and more talking to environmental law organizations, to the financial sector, to the reinsurance industry and risk analysts, to the urban planners, and to journalists. So very much, the action plan is very much directed to that kind of outreach. And so to have Jiří take on liaison with the the financial industry and reinsurance and risk analysts. He's co-chair now of that technical advisory group. This for me is very encouraging. We move slowly because we're volunteers. We don't have an external funder to allow us to build up staff and accomplish much more. But with our volunteers, we're all taking on individual tasks, and this one stands out for me as groundbreaking. Really, I know what the limitations are. I know what the potential is for us not to Marie's comment about cycles of hope. Here we are in another one, and I think this is a big one.
Well, I thank you, Wes. That's great. What I want to do now is move on to the questions. There's loads, aren't there, Thomas? Which is good, and unfortunately, we're not going to be able to deal with so many. Can you pick one out for us, Thomas?
Yeah. So just to summarize with regards to the questions, I mean, some express support. That's great. Some questions express doubt. That's quite expected. There's some highly complex questions, and I'm going to avoid sort of starting with those. Maybe what I consider sort of more of straightforward questions, and initially to you, Jiří and Alan. So, and I'm combining here 2 or 3 questions. So there's one from Juan Carlos Tejeda Gonzalez from Mexico. He says there's no such concept of no significant harm. In any project, something or someone will always receive significant harm. And when I say I'm going to combine it, there's one from Valentina Cavana from Italy. What relationship between HIA, so health impact assessment, and taxonomy? So I think there is a connection here between the 2 questions. What about all these other aspects that are represented by other types of impact assessment?
Well, I mean, I'll very, very briefly give a view on that, but I really want to pass it over to the panel, because rather than start answering too many questions myself, I mean, that's a really good point about do no significant harm, but it's part of the mindset change. I would totally agree that you don't see it because there's this balance, the way sustainability is viewed, there's this trade-off, and there are environmental losses, and the taxonomy only focuses on water, biodiversity, climate, so it's missing a lot of components, but it's a start and it's the beginning of a mindset change, and if we can protect those components, I think so much the better. And I've forgotten what the other one was now.
It's health.
Circular economy and
Oh,
pollution
health.
prevention.
Yeah, so health, I mean, it's like a really good question, but I mean, I kind of promote a determinants-based view of health. So if you protect the environmental determinants, then you go some way to protecting health. But it goes back to what Bryan said before, that do we want to protect the baseline we've already got? It's not very aspirational, and the baseline is sometimes not what we want, and that's the same for health. You actually have to look a little bit further and look for what positive gains that you might make. But anyway, anyone from the panel have a comment on either of those? Bryan and then Maria.
Thanks, Alan. The issue about significant harm, I think, is very important. I don't think there can be absolutes, but some of the other methodologies, such as resilience assessment, where you're looking at the potential for system failure, that identifies at least one criteria for significant harm. If you're going to have a change that leads to an environmental system or social system failure, that is clearly significant harm, and that can vary in different contexts. So I don't think we'll get a universal definition, but some of the resilience concepts, I think, can provide help in terms of looking at significance. And in relation to health impact assessment, I think that is very similar in terms of its methodology to environmental impact assessment. And it's an example of one of the areas where the concepts of the impact assessment methodology have been applied successfully to another area of sustainable development. And I think we need to be seeing an expansion of that impact assessment methodology to other sustainable development goals like health if we're going to be successful in dealing with the taxonomy for sustainable financial investment.
Thank you. And Maria, you put your hand up as well?
Yeah. To comment those two aspects, I would draw on a very short example. I visited once in Guinea-Bissau a rural village of very, very, very poor people. There were, unfortunately for them, lying on the site of a future exploration of a certain mining that I cannot remember now exactly what it was. And the company was absolutely prepared to pay for the reallocation of those people. And with that, there was no previous contact or questions whether that community, what they would need, what they would like, and they were going to be simply allocated. And perhaps, it came to my mind that from the company's point of view, that might represent do no significant harm, because for them, perhaps sitting in the US or Canada or Norway or wherever the company was coming from, that might mean a significant improvement in their lifestyle and their conditions of life. And I am not sure, after speaking with that community, if that would be the opinion of that community. So that is a very short example to respond both to do no significant harm, from the perspective of whom, and also to respond to the social and health and cultural aspects, which were in fact dimensions of sustainability that I did not see covered by the 6 environmental objectives. That's all.
Right, Ellen, you are muted.
Thank you, Marie. And I see that, Thomas, you've responded to someone who's asked about where they find the paper, and you've given a reference. And is it the case that it would be free in May, whether you're a member of IAIA?
That's the idea, exactly, that all the papers are going to be freely accessible, free of charge, during the month of May. Yep.
Okay, so people can find them there. So very quickly, I think we can probably try and answer another question.
Yeah, just to say that there is a number of questions that are answered by, well, what you have been referring to as the mindset change. So some people say, well, they haven't seen any signs of sort of deep ecology ambitions, for example. So, I mean, that's quite an important one. There's an interesting one here. Where is the pressure on the regulators? And that's by John Clark. And he refers to global regulators. And he says, well, Ministry of Environments have legal penalties for non-compliance. And he refers to a recent case, a mining company in Canada just received a 63 million fine. So pressure on the regulators. Any opinions on that?
Anybody on the panel have a view on pressure from regulators? Or Bryan?
Alan, one of the things that Jiří mentioned, I think, is very important. The regulators perform a verification function. One of the things that's missing from the EU taxonomy is that verification function. And I think if it's going to be successful and avoid Weston's concerns in relation to greenwash, there is going to be a need for some form of verification, whether it's by regulators or whether it's some form of audited self-management rather than regulatory compliance. I think that the key issue in terms of pressure on regulators really relates to how do we resolve the verification function.
It's like a really interesting point, because I think part of the arguments that myself and Jiří were making was that the society would regulate. Pension funds would stop investing in these financial institutions that were not behaving correctly. But of course, we don't know. It's not the same as having an enormous fine hanging over you, and it kind of relies on a social license to operate becoming almost a mandate. Oh, that's inspired some. So Maria.
Now, I was just going to ask whether you've considered the role of the auditors to play that verification, because after all, that's what they do. That's the business way of life. And and which they have been doing in companies for many, many years. And in that case, what's left for environmental impact assessment regulators? Jiří, you came in.
I'm very aware that Wes is also keen to answer that, but I did promise everybody at the beginning that we would finish on time, and it's really annoying that it was the same last time we did a webinar, Jiří. We get to a certain point and the discussion is just getting going, and it's just getting interesting and more interesting, and then we kind of have to draw it to a close. So I do apologize, Wes, but in order to finish on time, I need to hand over to Jiří, because he has to introduce another person and to kind of close proceedings and talk a little bit about what's going to happen next, which I think he'll be very keen on as well, Wes. So over to you, Jiří. And I think that for the rest of the panel, it's probably time we turned our cameras off. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was excellent debate, and Alan, you're quite right that we are just scratching the surface. And I would like to actually start before I introduce our distinguished guest for the closing remarks, but also to respond to I guess Maria's questions about the auditors. Let me just tell you what happened this morning to me at 5 o'clock in the morning, when I received yesterday a request from one of these big names in the auditing world, whether we could write a taxonomy certificate for one major enterprise in Czech Republic, because they kind of forgotten about it, and they wanted it by Monday. Yeah, and well, I looked at it and saw what they sent to me, and I thought, like, well, are we in the kindergarten? Yeah, because actually this was not feasible. I basically told them, look, even in a short period of time, you need 3 weeks to answer these questions seriously. You cannot do it over the weekend. And ideally, you should have a proper, like 2 months process and a dialogue with the respective operator. And I turned it down, what looked like a very lucrative assignment. So let's not put all of the hopes in the world of auditors. I think they are new to impact assessment profession. Some of them are underestimating, not undermining our work. And I think it will be actually very important to have these discussions with the professional community. Of the emerging professional community of sustainable finance practitioners, who are actually very knowledgeable about how the financial world behaves, and actually they would benefit from our insight. So we have actually, I would like to hear to introduce Linda Zelina from the International Sustainable Finance Center to quickly introduce her center, because we are, as Wes mentioned, we took on this task to help the climate change action plan, IAIA's climate change action plan, with the outreach to institutional investors. And since Linda and I have had lots of debates about taxonomy, I was very happy that she could join. So Linda, over to you to quickly introduce yourself and your colleagues, perhaps.
Thank you so much, Jiří, and thank you for having me here. It's been absolutely fascinating discussion, and I feel very privileged to be part of it. So thank you for the invite. So I'm the CEO and founder of the International Sustainable Finance Center, stands short for ISFC. We are working on sustainable finance topics, and sustainable finance to a lot of people is like this black box of many different things. We focus predominantly on sustainable investing, on green bonds, sustainable finance instruments. And what we try to do is we work across 3 pillars. Number 1 is generating knowledge by doing research. Number 2, convening. So we bring people together, especially people who usually don't talk and live in a bit of silos. And the third one is actually also capacity building and workshops, so very practical things where we can teach people new things, so they then have the capacity to engage with different topics. And I think just one quick note to finish, because I think Jiří has a lot more interesting things to say. We will try and help with linkages between these different pockets of expertise and knowledge, because I think very powerful things can happen once people see these topics from a different angle. And just today, Professor Robert Eccles from University of Oxford he's published a very good quote that often the marriage between sustainability and finance is like the marriage between state and church. Finance people think it's all a little bit of nonsense, isn't it cute? But sustainability people don't often know finance well enough. So I think that's our biggest challenge, to make sure that these parts come together and that the real economy actually starts reflecting something decent in terms of sustainability investment opportunities, because finance follows opportunity and it follows the investable universe. And I think we can do some very exciting things in that space. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Linda. As you can see, a sun started shining here when you were presenting these wonderful concepts. And indeed, I think actually we are at the dawn of a new era, and it really depends on us whether we actually foster these linkages or sow divisions. And I think with this attempt, with our papers in IAPA, and I hope there will be in the future more papers like this, or responding to some of the questions and exploring them and taking us further in IAPA or within the other journals. I think it would be really useful to have these professional exchanges, because it's a huge topic, and I think some wonderful quotes here from the workshop that actually we are really having, for the first time perhaps 50 years after the passage of NEPA, an instrument which obliges us not just to minimize the significant adverse impacts, but also to fix the cumulative problems and the legacy issues, as Bryan has very sharply pointed out, and to address the degrading carrying capacity problems in our ecosystems. I think I was very happy to hear a question from Maria on whether this is a revolution or not. We have discussed it in Brisbane. Myself, I think this is a revolution, and I was very happy to hear from Wes that actually he being one of the nesters of the US environmental protection policy and all the establishment of these agencies thinks the same. I think now EU has something to share globally. I think it will not just show what can be done within the realms of impact assessment or sustainable finance, but actually some of these frameworks which the EU taxonomy is referring, like the Water Framework Directive or Natura 2000 assessments and so on, integrated pollution prevention and control are, in my view, and I'm being European, has been checked. So I may not be a little biased, but I think they are fantastic tools. Sometimes a little heavy, but well intended, and I think they can actually be looked upon with a more as an inspiration. I think Angela and Thomas mentioned what the quality issues, the risk of greenwashing, and I think we have here in front of us a task to really define what we can do to contribute this process. I would like the next slide. Very quickly introduce some of our activities that we want to, where we want to promote this topic. These are annual meetings of IAIA. We want to have future webinars, perhaps special symposia or projects, and I think it would be very useful. I will not be in Vancouver, but if you could start discussing it, please share your ideas with us. We will try to accommodate and also engage the membership, because obviously this is an opportunity for major professional debate. I would like to close by inviting you, the next slide, to one of the endorsed events, which is by IAIA. I'm very happy that IAIA has endorsed the next the conference on the environmental assessments and the European Green Deal in Croatia, in Vodice, a wonderful spot. We've been there previously. It's Croatia, a wonderful host. This is going to be an event for up to 300 people. Please submit your abstracts and register early if you want to get a slot, and we hope to see you there, and then within the IAIA network. And with that, I would like to give a floor to Brigitte. Maybe I ran out over time, sorry.
Well, I'm just going to chime in quickly and thank you all of the presenters, Jiří and Alan, for organizing this. And it was a fantastic discussion. And as Alan said, we were just getting into it and could go on for a long time. And so I just want to just briefly mention we do have an upcoming webinar next week. So go ahead and register for that. And I do want to mention that you will be receiving a link to this recording in a day or two, as well as the link to the slides. Also in that email that you receive will be a survey, and it's a little bit more extensive than our surveys from our past webinars. If you've attended, there's a lot more questions that our organizers have asked to get your input on the topic. So please take a moment when you receive that email to respond to click the link for the survey and to complete that. We appreciate it. And so please share anything that you've learned. It's a great discussion. And final thanks to you guys as participants. Thank you all for being here today. We know that your time is valuable. We hope you found this to be of value as well. See you next time.